Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back after the teaching break. And welcome to everyone online as well. All right, we have two fantastic speakers today, but before I introduce Ho, who's our first speaker, I just want to make sure that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all meeting today, whether you're here in person or online. For us here on campus, this is the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connection to country. And we acknowledge the significant contribution that they have and continue to make to in caring for this land and sharing their knowledge and culture with us. And we also acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. All right. So it's my pleasure to welcome today our first speaker, Dr. Ho Phi Huyen. Ho will be talking to us about all things kind of humility. Ho is a lecturer in SMP. He received his Bachelor of Science in Psychology at the University of Arizona and his PhD at the University of California, Riverside. He is a social health psychologist whose primary interest is humility. For example, he examines patient health outcomes related to having a humble clinician. He is also interested in humility development. For example, what psychological factors underpin humility and how can they be leveraged to cultivate humility. Additionally, he's interested in studying and fostering university student success, particularly for minority students. He and his partner, Amanda, have two kids of 5 and 3 years old, and he enjoys playing and coaching volleyball in his downtime. Please join me in welcoming Ho.
I should probably send a shorter excerpt next time.
Yours is one of the shorter ones.
Oh, okay. I was telling my wife that most students talked last night. I was like, man, this. She's like, "Are you nervous?" And I was like, "Of course I am." But it's like a different nervous, right? Like the last time I was here, I was nervous because I was applying for the job, and now I'm nervous because I worry you guys would think that you hired the wrong person. So it's a different type of nervousness. But thanks so much for being here. I spent a little bit of time today just chatting about some of my works. On clinician humility and health. So generally today, I just want to summarize some works that I've done in this area. I'll focus specifically on just clinician humility and patient health outcomes, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I'm working on right now and some future directions and in hopes of perhaps building some collaborations across the board. Okay. So when we talk about humility, I think everyone sort of has their own conception of what humility is. And we can kind of see historically that humility has been defined in a variety of ways, and probably not the best ways either, right? So here you see that Aristotle defines it as sort of a defective state found in common classes of slaves, tradesmen, and women, right? That's kind of how all of these statements are. And children, it's an attribute that winners allocate to losers. And unfortunately, based on that kind of historical definition, early works in psychology sort of found that humility is related to incompetence, vulnerability, low self-esteem, and a bunch of other not so pleasant sort of outcomes. All that kind of shifted around sort of 2000. So actually, because of the way humility was defined, the field sort of just kind of, from a psychological perspective, stopped sort of investigating humility, right? And then around 2000, June Tangney wrote a paper in which she sort of redefined humility. And based off of that paper, particularly in the positive psychology world and the social psych world, has sort of served as this kind of reemergence of research in humility. So from then on, what researchers have found is much more kind of positive outcomes from humility, both in terms of physical health, social relationships. Of course, that kind of makes sense. Humility is sort of seen as like a social oil. It helps to repair relationships, particularly in relationships where there's bound to be friction. So what is her definition? And it's been reworked a few times, and I think it's still in the works. But generally, we think of humility as having sort of two main components. There's an intrapersonal component, kind of how you view yourself, and then an interpersonal component, which is kind of how you interact with other people. So in terms of the intrapersonal component, what humble people tend to do, they tend to have a secure, accepting identity. So they kind of know their strengths and weaknesses. They're not really, really defensive when they feel like others sort of hold different positions than their own. There's freedom from distortion. And I think this is sort of the key piece in humility's reemergence, is that humility in this way is seen as having an accurate sense of the self, right? But for a long time, humility was thought as having sort of a low sense of self. So here, right, we're not talking about seeing yourself too lowly, but you see yourself accurately, both in your strengths and your weaknesses. And then humility has an openness to new information component that later kind of becomes an intellectual humility component that kind of has split off into its own sort of studies. And then the interpersonal component, one has sort of this other focus and egalitarian beliefs. So essentially, you think that other people have important things to contribute, even if they hold a lower status, right? And this other focus, I know I used this example when I visited, so sorry. But this other focus, I think of it like this way, like imagine that you're attending like a pizza party, right? You know, maybe your department's done great, Mr. Reward, pizza party. And as you're in line, you see that, hey, maybe there aren't enough slices of pizza for everyone to have 2 slices, right? So you're in line, you can make one of 2 calls, right? You can go, oh, I don't think everyone's going to get 2, so I'm going to get 2 to make sure that I get 2. Or you think, oh, not everyone's going to get 2, so I'm only going to get 1 to make sure that other people have an opportunity to get 2. Right. So when we think of like being other focused, that's kind of what we talk about is sort of thinking about others before yourself. So that's kind of how we define it from the psychological perspective and in the psychological literature. But of course, right, what does humility look like in clinicians? Okay. So that's one of the questions that we had. So we asked patients, right? I mean, that's one thing we did. We said, hey, what specific behaviors or things, right, that the doctor that you recently saw made you think they were humble? So the idea here is just to broadly categorize behaviors that patients themselves think would be humble. Right? So this is what one of my outstanding RAs here, Caitlin. So we asked them this question. About 320 some participants responded, and a word cloud here, jumble. This took me like hours, guys. It shouldn't have, but it did. So please enjoy it. But things like things that they mentioned are doctors are considerate. They treated me with respect. They saw me as an equal. They're personal. I think humor is in there somewhere. They actively listen. So a bunch of different behaviors, right? So from this, we use sort of the Braun and Clark model for qualitative analyses in psychology, and we categorize them into 5 themes, right? And from this, what we see is that patients think doctors are humble when they are approachable, they respect patients as sort of as an equal, they display certain sort of nonverbal types of communication, so they tend to make good eye contact. They tend to not interrupt. And humble doctors tend to be patient focused. Of course, that overlaps with the other focus orientation of humility. And here, I think it's interesting that these doctors, patients see doctors as humble when they're willing to acknowledge their own limitations. right? And I think maybe this is something that sometimes doctors are sort of reluctant to do because they're sort of seen as the authority figure. But it seems like this is something that patients appreciate. Okay, so based on that definition, right, what do we think are some potential outcomes from having a humble clinician? Again, we went straight to the source. We asked patients. So we asked them to rate their most recent visit with a clinician. So it could be a doctor, nurse practitioner, physician's assistant, sort of the person who is responsible for their care. And then we also asked them about their satisfaction, their trust with the patient, or trust with the clinician, how healthy they're feeling. And we wanted to see if humility could predict those things above and beyond patient characteristics and clinician characteristics as well. Okay, that's my next door neighbor back in A&M San Antonio. So 2 studies, we asked both undergraduates at our university. You can see kind of older population for an undergrad, kind of maybe different than our population here. And then we also used a convenient sample through mTurk. So again, we asked them to rate their most recent doctor's visit. We asked them to rate their clinician's humility, satisfaction, trust, and health status. And then we also asked demographic questions about themselves, the clinician, and the overall visit. Like how long, was it easy getting an appointment? How long did they have to wait? And so on. So other factors that could potentially predict their satisfaction. So generally speaking, what we found is that humility predicted satisfaction, trust, and health status. Health status in undergraduates only predicted satisfaction and trust. In the mTurk, it predicted all 3 outcomes. So some preliminary sort of evidence to say that at least from the patient's perspective, that when they view their clinician as humble, they're also more likely to be satisfied, more likely to trust their clinician, and they're likely to report feeling healthier under the care of a humble clinician. So I think an important sort of question to ask is that, does humility only exist in the patient's head, right? Like, is it purely just perceptions of humility, or can we somehow sort of get at an objective sort of assessment of clinician? So what we did here, that's discussion. What we did here was that we looked at clinician-patient like audio recordings. So in this study, we wanted to avoid sort of relying on patient self-report, and we wanted to see if we can assess humility sort of objectively. Here's I always like to have a picture of Peter. And sometimes students will ask me, like, how did you get into humility research? But it's actually his fault. I was in the middle of doing my dissertation, and Peter wanted to include a measure of humility in a dissertation that I was doing on patient clinician relationships. And sort of from this project was how I evolved into focusing on humility. You know, I have 1 student here, so at least maybe that's. So anyways, so what did we do? We looked at data from doctor-patient communication training program. Here we have more than 150 clinicians at different primary care settings. To kind of save our coders some time, we selected 100 clinicians out of the 156. And each clinician had anywhere from like 7 to 10 audio recordings. Again, to save time, to save our coders some headache, we selected 3 patients for each clinician, and we selected them based on the highest, median, and lowest SES for each clinician. We had 4 coders rate each of the audio recordings. And of course, the recordings were provided in a counterbalanced order. What were we looking for? So the coders rated the physician's humility and also their communication style. And in addition to those ratings, we also had patient visited or the patient self-report. So after their visit, patients also filled out some surveys. And then we also have their demographics. So essentially, here's the data structure. You can see it's nested, right? So we use multiple multiple level modeling. And so generally speaking, what we see is that physician humility is related to better communication. And we see that physician humility is linked to higher health status. Okay. So kind of supporting what we found from the previous study, but here what we see is sort of physician humility is measured in sort of an objective, unbiased observer perspective. I want to make sure I save plenty of time for Christine here. So the first two studies were definitely, I think it showed that humility from sort of a cross-sectional perspective has potential to predict patient health outcomes, but we wanted to see whether or not humility has sort of consequences from a experimental perspective. And we wanted to see if sort of knowing a clinician's humility level would potentially affect future interactions with this clinician. So me and my 3 students set out to examine this via an experimental manipulation. So we recruited participants again from MTurk, and participants were randomly assigned to view one of 16 physician profiles. So it's a 2 by 2 by 2 by 2. Okay. So let me show this. Okay. So this is a very humble, right? So in the other condition, this would say not very humble. So that's the humility manipulation. We also wanted to see if humility mattered if you were sort of a competent doctor or sort of an incompetent one. So here is a low competent manipulation. The other ones, I think it was like 4.7 or something like that. So that would be high competency. We also wanted to see if humility would be affected by the gender of the physician. So we had Edward and Emily. And then we also wondered if there's sort of more leeway for a particular sort of specialty, right? So we had family medicine. Oh, bad time for my pointer to not work. Family medicine, and the other one was orthopedic surgery. The idea there is that we thought that maybe patients would be sort of more forgiving for more technical sort of disciplines in terms of their expectations about humility. Okay, so in this 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 design, we measured how likely they're going to sort of select that doctor and recommend that doctor. We asked them how likely they're going to adhere to that doctor's recommendations, their trust, their satisfaction, and how much they are willing to pay out of pocket to see that particular doctor. The main effects were entirely uninteresting, right? Like humility is just better for all these things. And so having, people just rated humble doctors higher on all of these items. But some of the interactions might be interesting to look at. I'm going to call out my own y-axis here. I just want to make it look clearer for you, but it's clearly truncated. I feel bad teaching stats and telling people not to. Anyways, sidebars. So what you see here is that when we look at anticipated satisfaction, it seems like humility matters more if you're in family medicine than if you're in orthopedic surgery. And sort of the same trend is true when we look at out-of-pocket spending, that it looks like there's sort of a higher expectation for family medicine, family doctors to be humble. So folks are more willing to pay to see a family doctor if they're humble. And here we see that humility, there's a expectation for humility when you're not as effective. So generally speaking, if you're rated highly, you're a highly competent doctor. It doesn't seem like humility matters, but it's particularly important if you have low ratings or you're perceived as not effective. So here, maybe what we see is that humility can serve as sort of a buffer, right? If a buffer for physicians who are deemed as not as effective. So generally, we think that it seems like humility may also affect sort of future interactions. Is that if you, if you somehow get word that this doctor is particularly humble or not, right? That could impact your future interactions with those clinicians. And so overall, we see that physician humility is important for patient's health, satisfaction, trust. And there's sort of a range of evidence, right, from the patient's perspective, from third-party rater codings, and also from sort of an experimental perspective. So what am I doing now? I'm continuing to sort of do basic research on physician humility. So for example, we're looking at medical companions perspective. So folks who accompany other folks to the visit to see what their perceptions of clinician humility is, and to sort of provide a more rounded perspective on clinician humility. Hopefully soon I'll get to develop a measure to capture physician humility specifically and not use sort of a broad humility measure. And I'm working to develop a more comprehensive model of physician-patient health sort of framework through humility. And I just propose sort of like a humility training program through the FAST grant. So maybe I'll get to do more work in this area, maybe not. And some other works I'm doing, besides looking at sort of clinician humility, I'm really interested in sort of the implications of being humble yourself. And so one area that I'm really interested in is looking at intellectual humility. So intellectual humility really kind of affects the way we interact with information. So I've done some work to show that intellectually humble folks are more likely to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. They're more likely to hold lower anti-vaccination attitudes. And right now, I'm looking at how intellectual humility might affect patient adherence more generally. And as a side gig, looking at different ways that we can cultivate humility. As a closing thought, so whenever I share that I work on humility or clinician humility, oftentimes people tell me, yes, I had this doctor and they were not very humble at all. You definitely need to study. You definitely need to make them more humble. And I think sure that's great. Like I think in the sense that you value the work, I think that's important. But from what I see from our data is that generally speaking, patients rate their clinicians pretty high already in humility. And so instead of thinking of it from sort of a deficit model that clinicians aren't humble and we need to make them more humble, I think the approach that I'd like to take is that I think most clinicians are humble already, but I think humility means a lot more than just, not being arrogant, right? And I think when we can funnel sort of physician behaviors, predicted or sort of productive physician behaviors through the lens of humility, right? I think we can more effectively train physicians. Instead of thinking about individual behaviors that clinicians have to do, right? I think that list gets to be pretty long. I think if we can say like, hey, how can you think about those behaviors and think in terms of just being humble? I think that framework might serve to more effectively sort of train clinicians. So yeah, looking at humility as more of an asset compared to a deficit. All right, thank you so much for your time. You have a couple minutes, right?
Yeah. So I have two questions. The first one is actually related to your last comments. If patients are already rating their physicians quite highly, I was just curious about the health status of your participants. Were they a mostly healthy population? Were there some who were in the system for chronic conditions? I think that could be an interesting interaction.
Yeah. So I think it depends on the study, but I think there is good sort of variability in our patients' health status. I think that's one thing about the work that's interesting is that we see that humble clinicians have healthier patients. It very much could be that humble doctors treat patients in a way that improves their health. Or I think the other way could be that, humble doctors tend to treat healthier patients better, right? So it could be that humble patients sort of lead to different clinician behaviors, kind of changing how humble they act. From some of the analyses we've looked at, it doesn't seem like the second thing is the case. It does seem like physician humility is leading to change in health, but I think that probably could use more exploration. That's a great question. Tegan?
Yeah, just sort of building on that, I really liked your look at competence as a sort of orthogonal factor to humility, but I'm also interested in how it might impact physician competence over time. So I'm thinking particularly like in the case of clinical psychology, I'm aware of some data suggesting that confidence and competence might, if anything, be negatively correlated in terms of clinician behavior, and especially in the more established clinicians. So I'm wondering if humility might actually enable, ongoing learning, for example, of physicians that could improve their competence.
Yeah.
Have you got any data that speaks to that chance, or is that an area of research?
I don't. I do. So the short answer is I don't, and I think that is something that I hope to explore. And so again, going back to the FAST grant, if anyone's on the panel, no, I think that the idea is hopefully we train clinicians on humility, and then not only are we seeing their patients' outcomes, but we can track their outcomes. So maybe we're looking at burnout, maybe we're looking at career satisfaction, and we're looking at sort of their overall growth in their career, right? Whether or not humility affects their willingness to learn and improve and so on. I think one thing that's related to humility is admitting when you're wrong. I think one really interesting outcome is that we see that when doctors admit that they're wrong, patients are less likely to sue them, at least in the American system, which is kind of counter to what we think, right? We don't want people admitting fault because that makes them liable. But what we see is that when doctors admit to being wrong, that actually decreases. Yeah, so maybe related, maybe not. Yes.
Thanks, Phoebe. So there's some other interesting relational aspects of this. And I've been a medical professional regulator, if you look at why doctors get complained against, the commonest cause is poor communication. And most patients will complain about them in relation to their communications ability or their interrelational, whether it's within amongst colleagues or with patients and their families. So I'm wondering if your notion of humility is a more complex aggregation of openness, curiosity, a range of other more elemental behaviors. And it might be worth exploring those constituent elements, particularly in the space of learning and professional development and personal growth, so it seems to be more of a phenotype of an insightful individual than a thing in and of itself. And I'm wondering if those constituent elements might be better to highlight, and ergo, if you develop curiosity, openness, awareness of your own limitations, these sorts of situational awarenesses, those then become collectively aggregated as humility, recognizable. Right. I'd be very concerned because we've been this group with resilience in the health professions. Teach people, train people to be resilient, train people to be humble. I'm not sure that's the way to do it. I think you need to either select in the right people and or develop and nurture them to demonstrate the right values. Because as a practicing chronic pain doctor, I see an awful lot of patients who were at their wits' end with doctors who just wouldn't be in the moment, wouldn't listen, wouldn't respect their perspectives. And all of those things were about openness, curiosity, hearing the patient's story, rather than any particular thing. But it's just this notion that patients complain about communication ability, and they'll forgive all manner of, as long as you treat them effectively, they get cured. Right. But I do worry that it's a more complex construct than
I totally agree with you. I think, and I think what we're really talking about is looking at, training humility or training clinicians from sort of a bottom up approach as opposed to kind of top down approach, right? Do we approach it, do we go humility, and then here are the things that make up humility, or do we train the individual behaviors, and then we go, okay, well, here is the thing that could potentially make up humility. So I could be completely wrong in this, but I think if the trend is to go bottom up, right? Here are all the various behaviors. And I think that definitely has merits, but I think that might, I think at some point you might overload people with like, okay, here are all the various things that you have to be worried about, right? Instead, if we approach it from sort of a top down, it could be sort of a simpler model, at least for people to remember. But hey, it looks like we got different thoughts. I don't want to cut into Christine's time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. All right, our next speaker is Professor Christine Phillips. Christine is a professor of Social Foundations of Medicine in SMP and the Associate Dean of Health Social Science. Christine trained in anthropology, medicine, and public health. Her transdisciplinary research focuses on primary care systems and the voices of consumers and community. She is a practicing general practitioner who has been the medical director of the ACT's Refugee Health Service for over a decade. Please welcome Christine.
So this is a blind match. We've never met each other before, and yet we are talking about the same thing. So I was really delighted when I saw what you were going to talk about, because I wanted to talk about a project that we have been doing on diagnosis of rare diseases and how clinicians think about rare diseases in the context of how patients think about rare diseases. And this has probably been one of the more revelatory studies that I've done as a clinician, and much of that ended up focusing on the nature of humility, intellectual humility, but interpersonal humility as well. So we've never met one another, but these will flow on from one another. I'll have to keep, that's here, great. So this project was funded by the Commonwealth, which had a tranche of funding that was around improving the diagnosis of rare diseases, most of which went to the Rare Diseases Association, which produced a very big piece of work. And then there was a little bit left over for some of us who were doing much smaller pieces of work. The problem and the challenge here is that rare diseases are rare in that they affect less than 5 per 10,000 persons, each individual rare disease. And there's about 7,000 rare diseases in Australia, which are life-threatening or life-altering. But about 1 in 12 Australians live with a rare disease. So collectively, they're not rare. And clinicians are very likely to come across all kinds of rare diseases in their, I'm a GP, in my general life, I'm going to come across rare diseases, even though the individual rare disease is going to be quite rare. So, so that's one thing. These are, in fact, actually this polyglot set of conditions that present often enough for us to be thinking about them, but individually, they are all different. And mostly the person who knows the most about them is the patient, not the clinician, in fact, almost always. Rare diseases also often present with vague symptoms, and they can be difficult to diagnose. Those rare symptoms, those vague symptoms look like other conditions, asthma or much more common diseases, or common coughs and colds, fatiguing illnesses, the things that you would see every day of your life, but some of those are rare diseases. However, most patients that present with ongoing rare diseases, they're actually considered and probably are medically undiagnosed. That is, maybe they're a rare disease, but we don't have a title for it. So this is the position that clinicians find themselves in and patients find themselves in when they're trying to negotiate, perhaps my symptom is a rare disease. So what we did with this funding that we got was we wanted to look at the types of journey paths to diagnosis of people with rare diseases. And the rare diseases we used were myositis, primary immune deficiency, and sarcoidosis. And one of the reasons we chose them was because they're actually not that uncommon, any of them. Many people know somebody with sarcoid, or you probably know somebody with all of these actually. But they're still rare enough that I have only ever looked after 3 or 4 people with sarcoid in my practice. And they all presented with something that looked like something else. And they had very good consumer organisations and consumer leadership. So this was a collaborative piece of work with those organisations. And we also want to look at the challenges that clinicians have in making a diagnosis of a rare disease using these 3 exemplars. And then we were required to develop some translational tools for use in education, which, as I in the end developed them a few months ago, it became clear to me that it was all about humility. The tools that we developed were not knowledge-based. They were about actually these kind of humility and attitude-based. The project itself, it hasn't all come out, include systematic reviews of diagnostic delay. They've been published. They're not that interesting. I'm not going to spend any time on those. Journey mapping with 26 people who had one of these rare diseases, and then think aloud interviews with clinicians about how they approach these exemplary evolving cases. And then in the end, we had some filmed interviews, and these are, this thing that hasn't come out here is we developed some interactive games that in which, if you were insufficiently, I haven't used that term, but insufficiently humble, you wouldn't make the diagnosis. And in fact, very often on this, it's a branching game using twine. If anybody knows those rather simple choose your own adventure games, many students who made specific decisions end up with the patient leading them. So, and patients here in Australia, at least, they leave the doctor that doesn't serve them well. And so that doctor never gets that feedback. They've just gone somewhere else. So we'll take the 26 interviews from the patient's view. And I'm going to present primary immune deficiency here, just to give you some idea of the breadth of stories that people were telling us. The first one is, so the pretty dots are years. So 23 years was the longest that somebody could rate the first time they presented with their symptoms to a clinician. So that's the beginning of the journey maps to the end. Well, this one is a kid with severe combined immune deficiency. And so this was diagnosed almost at once. And the reason for that is because it's a life-threatening condition, and you would be a really dumb person if you didn't actually, you wouldn't be a good clinician if you didn't pick up. You don't need to go through the whole history to see this is actually something that presented with a dire life-threatening pattern, and it was diagnosed at once. So there's nothing complicated about that. That's actually an acute illness that was diagnosed. The doctor realised it was a problem, referred them to the hospital, and the hospital diagnosed it at once. This is a more usual journey for people with primary immune deficiency syndrome. And this one took 10 years to be diagnosed, and started with the person being admitted to hospital with a lot of vague symptoms, actually obstetric symptoms. And these symptoms, so primary immune deficiency presents with recurrent infections of some form. And so the person presented with pneumonia. They went to a sinus specialist. They had unstable asthma. They had pneumonia. Saw a number of there's 2 different GPs they saw, and 3 different specialists that they saw along the way, being referred back and forth for different episodic but severe conditions. And finally, in the end, they did see a GP, a specialist, an immunologist who diagnosed it in the end. So this is not to say how clever that immunologist is. By the time these rare diseases get to the specialist, they are ready to be diagnosed. The issue is this kind of long wait in between, particularly this area here, where the person was very sick. The GP was concerned. They were going back and forth, but they never got to the diagnosis. And this is somebody who it took them 13 years for diagnosis, and presented with multiple different presentations. This person had melanoma, so there was something else going on as well. But they also had a whole lot of different symptoms that were variously referred by the GP gatekeeper to a rheumatologist. The specialists were cross-referring. There was a person was admitted with different things. There was a diagnosis of shingles and antiviral treatment started. So the presenting situation of constant infections was hidden partly by the fact that there was another condition there that had big explanatory power and had to be managed, and that was the melanoma. And also because they were going to different specialists. I hasten to say that in all of these, these people who were giving us these histories were not recounting hopeless, they weren't telling hopeless doctor stories. They were actually recounting just their journeys. And in these situations, any rare disease, people with rare diseases tend to have a fairly teleological approach to their history. Everything back at the beginning reflects what I ended up with. Maybe some of these early things didn't reflect, maybe it developed a bit later, but all of them bounced around between multiple doctors with subacute, sometimes quite acute illnesses without the diagnosis being landed. And one of the strategies that patients used in this situation is not helpful. They normalised their condition. They said, well, in fact, this is somebody with myositis, two different people with primary immune deficiency saying, well, I was tired, but there were reasons for that. I had all my kids. There were all of these other things. I have lots of children. That's why I've got constant, rhinosinusitis. There's a lot of reasons. One in the middle was working in childcare. She had a reason to think why she might have recurrent infections. So for quite a long period of time, and even before they first presented to the doctor, there was this process of normalising fatigue or their other vague symptom. So if they approached a clinician with a normalised situation, many people actually, their first presentation was in the middle of somebody else's presentation, the child's presentation or something, because they'd engaged in this process of actually attempting to read their symptoms as part of just everyday episodic life. If the clinician then said, well, I think it's this diagnosis. I think you've got really bad asthma. I think you've got it looks like you've got pneumonia again. How unlucky for you. You must be working in the wrong job. If the clinician discounted it, then the patient tended to discount it as well. So there was this kind of double discounting that went on in the ones that were prolonged for a long time. So here's the number 13 saying, I got tonsillitis, pneumonias. I was taking a long time to recover, but the clinicians would just treat the infection as it came up, the thing in front of them. And so I went with that. And the one down the bottom with sarcoidosis. Sarcoidosis is super difficult to diagnose. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. But here, this person's saying, I kept going back, and they would say, you've got bronchitis, you've got these various things. Even when the clinician said, my father had sarcoid, which when the patient said that, which should have driven them, the double discounting kept going on. So these patterns of actually clinicians, in fact, engaging with the thing in front of them and the patients themselves just trying to build it into their everyday life, we saw across all of these conditions. To capture how doctors thought about it, we did some talk-through interviews in which we had scenarios that had sort of come from the journey maps developed by the patients, but were then changed so that they couldn't be identifiable. And it's quite a practical thing. Cards are put down on the table and say, this thing then happened. What's your thinking about this? This then happened. What's your thinking? How are you thinking about it? And so clinicians really engaged with this. We had both specialists in the discipline of the rare disease and GPs reflecting on it. Here's an example. This is a version of the talk through interview held for a young person with what turned out to be primary immune deficiency, 14-year-old kid. There's always in these stories quite a lot of background information or information that's not really germane to the problem, because that's what happens in real life. Clinicians, in thinking about it, have to actually distinguish through it all. And the card goes on and on and on. And we presented this. We started off saying, you did this and you did this. And we found that GPs got really quite jumpy if you said, you did this and this. We had to say, Dr. Anderson, what do you think of what Dr. Anderson did? The specialist didn't mind that at all. And it goes on and on and on and on. And eventually Anton starts fainting. It goes on further, but the information is provided along the way. And the clinicians, the whole way through it, they're talking about how they think through this problem. And that's the end. Actually, Anton gets diagnosed at about 17. But there's all this extra stuff going on in his life that a GP would be dealing with as well. He might be much more interested. There's a split up in the family. There's a whole lot of psychological issues. Even though Anton is presenting with recurrence, if you just took out the fact that he's constantly presenting with terrible rhinosinusitis and pneumonia, it might strike you, but actually there's a whole lot of other stuff. The minutiae of people's lives that kept clinicians kept going down trying to sort those out. And that's not wrong. It's just the ways they think about these conditions. So and I have to thank my colleague, Dr. Turgal Namsrai, for every case, she actually mapped the clinical reasoning processes that they had been undergoing. So you can see there's the type, the doctors use this a lot. So type 1 is where you recognise the pattern, and type 2 is where you stop and you say, oh, I've got to think more deeply about this. I've got to be more humble. I've got to think more about what's going on. And the issue for us is, when do people stop working on type 1 thinking, in which they might say, oh, it's probably likely to be these things, or what's the worst thing it could be? All right, well, I don't think that person has got a cardiac problem. I'll go on. What is the pattern? And then trying to forage information around these ideas. And the question for us is, when do they switch to thinking more deeply? And usually it was, this is a really complex presentation and it's been going on for a long time. I'm going to think a little bit harder about this. I wouldn't have thought this would happen. I don't understand why this is happening. I really have to think about healthcare issues here. Anton was a case of somebody who really couldn't access healthcare. So the clinician had to actually think, well, I've got to take this on. I can't just bounce them off to somewhere else because there is nowhere else to bounce them off. This is really urgent. This is in a really interesting context. What they have to pick up is how do they switch to something that is a lot more slower in thinking through the pattern. Type 1 to type 2. So I was going to just summarise the two perspectives of the suspended diagnosis. So the patients really are in this condition of not having this diagnosis. And it wasn't that they were being told actually that they had medically undiagnosed symptoms. They were being told they had another condition most of the time. So patients in this situation, after they've gone through a period of, discounting or normalising it, they start to think this is not right. This shouldn't have gone on for so long. So they start contesting the given diagnosis. They may research the potential diagnosis. They may be quite keen to get another opinion. They may start to self-treat what they think you should have for this condition, and they persist. And this comment of one of our consumer co-researchers talking about what it is, who had also had some time for a diagnosis, but she said, being in the slew of medically undiagnosed symptoms is a terrible place for a patient to be. Even if your diagnosis means you can't get treatment, you need to And even though there are lots of conditions that are medically undiagnosed, we can't identify them. We have to have some way of thinking about medically undiagnosed symptoms that doesn't result in the person being dismissed, even if the diagnosis doesn't exist. With clinicians, though, what we saw is that they tended to particularize to a diagnosis and do that quite quickly. Your respiratory condition is asthma. I'll treat that. Oh, it's come back again. It's the ACT, it's the allergy capital of Canberra, there's Australia. You've got this issue. That's really unfortunate. What trees do you have outside? So they're particularizing, and then they adumbrate around that diagnosis. What are the things that we can do that there's a good clinician will do this that can prevent it rather than just sending them off with another script. But then they do the same thing again, and they persist too. And they seem to be in a churn of a good enough medical diagnosis. It's defensible, but it's been going on for so long that it's time for them to switch to another way of thinking. And I will give you an example. This is really why this is actually quite a revelatory study for me, because in the process of doing this study, I personally, in my own patient population, diagnosed 2 people with sarcoidosis and 1 person with primary immune deficiency who had been my patients for a decade. So I began to see how sticky it is when you are working around, particularizing around one particular diagnosis. And this condition actually happened, this situation happened to me 2 weeks ago. As I was thinking about this course, I thought, I've changed the situation, but it's a 32-year-old lady who has psychosis. So there's a major presenting issue. And she's on depot injections and she's under a treatment order. And she presents to our clinic every day with a stuffy nose. She's a tiny little nose and it's really stuffy and she's really uncomfortable. And after 2 weeks of her presenting every day with a stuffy nose, I began to think around the diagnosis, but I didn't contest the larger section in which it was. I thought, is this a medication side effect? It could be. These depot drugs do lead to nasal congestion. I'll ring the psychiatrist. Is this household mold? Is she particularly prone to this? It could be. I know her house has a lot of mold. She's always complaining about it. I wrote a letter to housing. I did all these things. Is this just part of her psychosis? She's actually got a delusional disorder and she just fixated on this, her conditions. I spoke to the psychiatrist again. And then I thought, I should stop now. She's been in that house for a long time. She is on this medication, and that is a clear and present diagnosis. But I should think more about this as I'm about to give this lecture on it. In the meantime, I'd sent her off because I thought, maybe she's got this chronic sinusitis. I'd sent her off to get a CT of her sinus, which is shocking. You know, she's got utter sinusitis and polyposis, everything. And that I actually stopped and started going more slowly through it. And I realized that this was the presentation of primary immune deficiency and I had ignored it. And interestingly, she does have primary immune deficiency. It's the first one in her community that I know about. And so I think if even I doing this study and thinking about these sort of things had got stuck on a diagnosis, I think it is a very something that clinicians find very difficult to do. Once you've got into a particular way of thinking about something, it is very hard to step back from that and to say, let us reassess. And it's really important, this is my teaching element for the clinicians afterwards, that people are willing to actually look at the pattern fail. How is that? That's gone on for too long. The symptoms are more severe than they should be. The symptoms are more diverse than they should be. And this is what the clinicians are saying. As they're starting to work through these cases, this doesn't fit anymore. I have to stop. I have to be persistent. I have to be prepared to review. I have to be prepared to seek advice, which is a humble thing to do. And I have to focus on what the patient is thinking. And patients sometimes come up with completely the wrong diagnosis, but it's not as though the two of us are approaching one another with one correct diagnosis and one wrong diagnosis. We're probably both going down the wrong track. So we did develop some learning materials, and you can find them if you Google this. This is on the medical school website, and down the bottom there are the videos of clinicians trying to do that process, drawing on what the clinicians had said in their interviews, trying to do that process where they backtrack in the middle of a consultation and start to rethink. And also there are 3 choose your own adventure games, which are mainly directed at medical students, in which the evolving situation, the evolving clinical scenario has many opportunities where you could be humble and reassess. But if you don't, the patient will leave you, or if you say this is actually just menopause, well, you won't see the patient again, but you haven't actually solved anything for anybody. So that's my thank you. Thank you to the Commonwealth Department of Health and my colleagues over at NSEP and our colleagues from Myositis Immunodeficiency Foundation and Sarcoidosis Lyme Australia. I think the take-home message of this for me is actually that we are not humble in diagnosis, and that even those who say they try to approach it, that they, in the hurly-burly of managing people with whom they are too familiar, can actually, but they don't know the history, they can cling to their diagnosis too much. And so I do think being conscious about, am I making a mistake here? Do I have to actually step back, take a few breaths and reassess is a really important thing for clinicians to do. Even if in the end they don't come to a rare disease, a diagnosis, they may be coming to a better relationship with the patient than they had at the beginning. And that is the end of our collaborative slide match.
We have time for